welcome everyone. My name is Scott Dixon. I'm a customer engineer here at Salto. I help customers onboard and implement with our solution, which I'll talk about probably a little bit more when we get into the group demo aspect of the webinar. And with me today, I have Alex. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Alex Ortiz. I am a content creator, mainly focusing on Atlassian content. And people call me Dr. Jira for taking folks on their Jira healing journey, and I help people with their Jira problems.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about DevOps for Jira. Why, what some of the challenges of managing a Jira environment for admins, and how Salto can help address some of those challenges. And we'll jump into a group demo and show you exactly how Salto does that. Now, just a couple of housekeeping. We have a chat down there, so please feel free to use that chat if you've got any questions. We also do have a Q&A where you can ask specific questions, and we will answer them throughout the presentation. We love questions, so please feel free to ask away. And then later on during the during the presentation, we will ask you all to complete a poll. All right. So again, Scott and Alex here. We're going to be talking about DevOps for Jira. So why are we talking about DevOps for Jira? So taking a step back, today, modern companies, SaaS applications are running most modern companies. So in addition to Jira, there's a lot of other applications out there that likely your company is leveraging. Applications like NetSuite, Salesforce, Zendesk for customer support, and so on. Now, all of these apps require a deep level of customizations. As you as Jira admins know, there's a lot that you need to do to make these applications, to make Jira work for your use cases. And a lot of these tools are kind of no or low code tools, and they're used throughout the IT and business application stack. Now, it's great that these tools are easy to configure, but they come with some unique challenges of their own. Some of these challenges that we see are, how do we really know what is implemented? How do we know, why a change was made or who made that change? Or what will the impact of a planned change be? And what will that impact be to Jira? What will that impact be to other systems? How do we develop these changes reliably without impacting production? Alex, I'm sure you probably have a story about in the field about, making a change to production directly and having some sort of unexpected consequence.
Definitely do not recommend it. But I can definitely assure you that I've been in that situation more times than I would like to admit, where you think it's harmless, you think it's just going to be just a little change, and it ends up having these unintended consequences. So definitely can share specific horror stories if you want to hear them, but I've been there before.
We'll probably get to some of those specific stories later, but that's one of the problems that we want to kind of address with Salto. Now, a couple other challenges are, how do we review changes that are happening to production? And how do we create a collective code ownership? How do we reliably promote these changes to production? And then how do we roll back or revert changes if necessary? And how do we keep a paper trail for compliance? Now, what we wanted to do here at Salto is take all the best practices and tools from DevOps methodologies and put them into the business and IT applications. All right, so I'm going to launch a poll. I can just curious about the audience. When got two questions here in the Zoom poll, if you don't mind answering. One about when would you use your Jira's? When are you currently using a Jira sandbox? And then how are you documenting changes made to production? I'll give you all just a couple seconds to make that. Looking at the comments, Paula, anyone who's spent time as a Jira admin at least has one horror story. I'm sure that's definitely the case. So I'll share the results of the poll a little bit later on, but please keep that going. All right, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, and we'll make sure that those questions are addressed. Awesome, so we're getting some great questions coming in. And keep them coming, and I will continue on. So when we say DevOps for IT application, what does that mean? So wrote down a couple of these, and we'll show you later on exactly how Salto can help you achieve each of these. So one is we need a complete textual representation of the environment to enable visibility. In other words, it allows us to answer questions like, what is implemented? What are the dependencies of a particular configuration? Now, we also need a version of that representation in some sort of source control system like Git. We need code analysis tools to show dependencies and the impact of making a change. And we need to create a shared responsibility within the team. So everyone should be aware of major changes. It shouldn't take anyone by surprise that a certain feature has been pushed to production. And we should be developing in high fidelity sandboxes because mainly two reasons. One, we want to be able to not impact production, be able to test out, develop changes in a way that's not going to impact for our end users. But at the same time, we want to be able to make those or test those changes in a sandbox that actually represents production. It doesn't really do us a lot of help if our sandbox doesn't actually align with production. We also need some sort of change proposal process. So we need a way to approve changes. We also need a way to be able to roll back those changes. And then we need some sort of paper trail to be able to know exactly what those changes are. Now, once we have all of that in place, the ability to do a backup of your configuration is almost a side effect of that, which I'll show here when we start to demo with Salto. So everything I've talked about so far is not necessarily specific to Jira. For a company to be successful with these, they should have the same standardization across all the business applications. So I mentioned a couple below here. Just wanted to mention that Salto does work with beyond Jira, other key business applications that your company is probably using, like Salesforce, NetSuite, Jira, Workato. And that being said, we'll jump right into the demo. And again, as you have questions, please keep them coming. All right, so I'm going to walk you through a demo of the Salto platform today. And just to give you kind of an idea about where we're going to be walking through, the first part, going to show you kind of what sort of metadata Salto is pulling down, how you can use Salto to explore the relationships between those configurations. Then moving into how Salto can help you deploy changes between any two environments. And then finally wrapping it up with how Salto helps you document and monitor the entire change management process. So after you connect and authenticate to Salto, Salto will fetch the environment. Now, a fetch is an operation in Salto that pulls down all of the configuration metadata that makes up a particular Jira environment. Now, we're just talking about the metadata. So that's the automations, the workflows, the projects, all the schemes. And then you can use the Explore tab over here to explore everything that is already set up. Now, within Salto, this is a great place to come in and see, do you have duplicate fields set up? Do you have maybe some tech debt that's set up? You can also dig into specific configurations that are set up. So for example, I've got a workflow that I recently implemented in my sandbox environment. I can open it up in Salto, and then I can also see the particular dependencies. Now, anything that you see in Salto that's underlying, you can click through to see how it's set up. And if I open up, for example, this status, I can now see its dependencies. Sorry, not the dependencies, but rather where it's being used. I can see that it's being referenced in 3 different workflows, a filter. This is really helpful for that impact analysis piece. So let's say that I wanted to make a change to the status or even remove the status. I can immediately understand where that's being used across the environment. Alex, I'm interested in, did you ever come across a time where you kind of, you know, went to make a change either in production or sandbox and didn't really know where a configuration is being used, and either, what were your strategies there to be able to really understand the impact of that change?
Yeah, I've had a couple of instances where the I'm trying to find the right words, but the beautiful thing and the worst thing about Jira, especially when you're doing configuration changes, is that it's sometimes low risk, but that gets you comfortable because there's certain elements in Jira that are high risk when you're making changes, right? And so a lot of folks usually get confused with like the schemes and like if you're doing like a workflow change and that workflow is tied to a scheme, if you don't pay careful attention to like the little number of how many projects share a scheme, you tend to make a change that you're going to commit to, that you're going to like push, right? And instead of just doing that change to that one little piece of Jira that you thought you were doing it, like because the way these schemes are configured and the way these schemes can be shared, you can actually be tapping into different areas. And it can cause some significant problems in Jira world. And unfortunately, once you make those changes, sometimes it's really, really hard to roll those back if you don't have external tools. So I've definitely been in that situation where if you just a little oversight, I'm like, okay, I'm just adding a status to a workflow. And all of a sudden I get all these emails from people going like, what is this new status? And I'm like, you shouldn't see that status. So definitely has
Yeah,
happened many times.
awesome. So I want to jump right into how Salto can actually help you deploy these changes from one environment to another. So I'm going to jump into the compare and deploy part of Salto and open up the compare and deploy. Now for the demonstration today, what I'm going to show is that workflow that I had created in Sandbox. I'm going to take that and promote that up to my production environment. So in Salto, I'm going to select the source as my Sandbox environment, and I'm going to select my production environment. And now I'm going to give it a title. So really simply going to call it add new workflow. Now, I noticed in the poll, when we asked you all, how are you documenting changes to production? A majority of you said that you're using Jira tickets or another ticket management platform to actually track the changes that are being made. And kind of almost equal amounts of you are using Confluence or another collaborative documentation platform, which is great. So if you are using a ticket platform, like for example, Jira itself, I could also take that ticket. Like for example, here I've got a ticket that says I need to add that new workflow for updating teams. Now I'm ready to go ahead and push it into production. And I can go ahead and put that ticket ID in the deployment name. I'll show you how that's going to all tie together here at the end. But this can be a really good way to keep everything documented in that single Jira ticket. Now, as soon as I click on compare and deploy, Salto is going to instantly show me all the differences in between these two environments. Now, one thing to note here is during the demonstration, I am showing you an example of pushing from sandbox to production. So that this example here is showing that if I'm doing a comparison between those two environments, it's going to take about 616 changes. So these are two environments that are not very, very closely aligned to get production looking like sandbox. Of that, so many are additions, so many modifications, and so on. Alex, how common, or I guess, yeah, maybe just simply how common is it for in customers, clients that you've worked with for the sandbox to be out of line, and what sort of problems or challenges does that lead to?
I think it's pretty common because once you make your sandbox, you have two options. You can either have an empty sandbox or you can clone production data to your sandbox. But because it's always living, right? You never turn off Jira. Seconds later, they're out of sync, at least from an issues perspective, right? But then comes the trial and error type of phase where you're making changes in your sandbox and you're trying this and you're trying that, and you're not really always 100% sure. So there's a lot of iterations of like, let's just see if this works or not. And before you know it, you're very far away now from your production instance, right? Because you've done so many iterations of just testing that, yeah, it's very common, and very quickly you will get to that phase where your two are out of sync.
Yeah. So again, I'm using the example today going from sandbox to production, but you can also use Salto to go the other way around. So if you have made changes directly in production, a hot fix or an admin just going ahead and making a change in production, you can use Salto to push that back. I did see a question come in, said, can I use this tool across different Atlassian orgs? Does each org have to license Salto? If I understand correctly, probably asking, can we deploy changes between prod sites, different prod sites? And that is something that Salto can do. I've actually worked with customers here at Salto that have multiple production sites that they are supporting, different, like, for example, business units, and they need to push out the same kind of templated workflows, templated automations, templated projects out to these multiple production sites, and they're using Salto to do that today.
So Scott, let me ask you then, just to echo. So I think what they're
Yeah.
asking though is like, let's assume we have two companies and we want to
Mhm.
go between two different companies, Juris. With that as long as you have access or as long as you have the right administrator privileges on both,
Oh,
I would assume it will work, right?
correct. Yes, yes. Sorry, I misunderstood that one, but yes, yeah, that would work as well.
Yeah, because the org is usually a collection of Jiras, if you will, one or
Mhm.
many. And so if you're talking different orgs, then that to me is talking like two separate entities completely, right? Not usually the
Yes.
same entity. Because yeah.
Yeah, thanks for helping clarify that one, Alex. But yes, yeah, you could also deploy between those different orgs as well. The completely separate orgs. All right, so coming back to the comparison view that we're taking a look at. One other thing to note is that with Salto, you can also export all of these changes as a CSV. So if I open this view up in Salto and realized, wow, I've got a huge amount of differences in between these two environments, we need to talk about an alignment process. Maybe we need to refresh the sandbox. Maybe we need to use Salto to align these, but regardless, you can export these as CSV. One thing to note is if you do want to refresh your sandbox, Salto does offer this view here, this additions tab, that will essentially show you all the configurations that are sitting there in your sandbox that have not been moved to production. Alex, have you ever run into a case where you accidentally overwrote things or development that was sitting there in your sandbox? You went to refresh your sandbox and realized that you wiped out a bunch of active in development projects.
I have, because when you make your sandbox, the only way that you know that you're in the sandbox is the URL has the word sandbox appended to it. Other than that, they look exactly identical. So one pro tip that I usually tell people is like, change the color of the banner. Make it a little bit more obvious that you are indeed in a sandbox, because it is very, very easy for you to look into it, because it's especially when you do a carbon copy of your production data, it's gonna look just like production. So if you get confused or you forget which URL you're in, you're thinking that you're deleting it in one environment when you're actually in the environment you need it. And trust me, there's no worse feeling in the world when you delete something you need. And in Jira, once it's gone,
Mhm.
at least out of the box.
Yeah. So this additions tab can be really, really helpful ahead of that refresh, just making sure that there's nothing kind of sitting there in that sandbox that needs to get moved out first. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and select these changes to deploy into my production environment. Now, using Salto, you can quickly filter and sort to the changes that you want to see. Now, I've got a workflow that's called update team. So I use the search bar up here to search directly for it. Pulling this up in Salto, I can see the workflow. I can see that it's an addition, and I'm going to select it for deployment. As soon as I select it for deployment, you'll notice that these required dependencies and additional dependencies tabs start to populate because Salto is using what we know about its relationships to other configurations and flagging those as required dependencies. In this case, it looks like we've got this on hold status that doesn't yet exist in my target environment, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. Now, something that might be interesting for the audience is that it's also going to flag any additional dependencies. What that means is any of its dependencies that also has specific changes. So in this case, it looks like someone has updated the open status in my sandbox environment. But if I really dig into that, it looks like someone's just updated the status category. It's not necessarily a change that I need to make in my production environment. But the reason I bring that up is that Salto allows you to select which changes you want to push over. Some configuration management tools might take the entire change and overwrite in any of the related changes. But with Salto, you're going to be able to focus on just the changes that you want to pull over. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward with the deployment process. And while this is running, just to kind of explain what's doing here, is Salto is running a validation on the deployment itself. So based off of the elements that you selected, are you going to be able to make these changes? Do we have any additional required dependencies? Also, while this process runs, I wanted to share some results from the poll. So for the question on when do you use your Jira sandbox, some pretty interesting results. So about 50% of the audience here said that, which is great. They're using their sandbox before making almost any change to production. So I bet if you pulled up in Salto the sandbox and production environment, we probably see that they were pretty aligned. And then we've about 31% of you are using the sandbox, but really only before making major changes to production. And then 19% of you are hardly using it or not using it at all. All right, so now that the deployment preview has completed.
So Scott, just to really
Yes.
shout out, right? You do need to have a premium or enterprise version of Jira in order to be able to have a sandbox. So just as a shout out, in case you guys are gonna go look for a sandbox, it's not available to every subscription model, right? You do need to be premium or enterprise, and only your org/site admins can create the sandboxes for you.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for bringing that up. All right, so now that the deployment preview has completed, this is kind of the review process. So in Salto, it gives you a number of different ways to be able to complete this process. Now, if you noticed here, I've got a modal here that says pending, and my deploy and push is grayed out. Now that's because I've enabled some features in Salto that essentially takes what I want to deploy and turns it into a pull request into one of my connected, into a connected Git repo. Now, Salto is compatible with all the major Git providers like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and so on. And in my demo here, I've got a connection with GitHub. So let me show you what this looks like. Now, I know you're used to seeing your Jira configurations in the UI, seeing like what the workflow looks like in terms of like a diagram. But what we've done in Salto is basically translate all of that into a flat file structure. And we represent all these configurations as a file called Knuckle, Knuckle, which stands for not another configuration language, which allows us to do things like create versions of the configurations over time, create a pull request process. And if I look at the files changed, I can see what is going to be actually changed. So in this case, adding a workflow, adding this status. If I was doing any sort of modification, it would show a side-by-side comparison. Now, the powerful thing here is that once you use this process with Salto, you can essentially use this to kind of create an approval process. So if you see below, it's saying that I need someone to review this pull request, otherwise I can't deploy, which is why if I come back to Salto, this deploy button is grayed out. So I actually cannot move forward with this process unless I get an approval. Alex, I'm curious, have you ever worked in using some sort of approval process with getting changes made to production, even if it's informal, just getting like a thumbs up in a Slack thread?
Yeah, so yes to your question, but I just want to echo how revolutionary this really is. Because as a Jira admin, I've been doing this for 7 years. You don't really have an easy paper trail to have, right? Like you can do emails, which are a hassle. You can do the tickets, which are good and helpful, right? You can even put approvals there. But putting them into a Git repository like this and just being able to have that traceability is really, really powerful in the sense that it just, again, it's not something that a typical Jira admin is accustomed to doing, right? But when it comes to auditing and just having a solid paper trail, like this right here is such a nice feature to have because it's so much easier to just point to records that you have in here versus trying to dig up emails from like a year ago and trying to figure out, oh, did that right person, was they really authorized to approve it or whatnot? But yeah, usually it's like via email, right? Usually it's a very, I don't want to use the word antiquated, but it's more of a non-official format, which it tends to not hold up pretty well during an audit.
Mhm. All right, we had a couple of questions come in, by the way. So one question was, what kind of access does Salto require? Do you have Jira security certifications? So Salto requires the admin level access to be able to access the actual environment. Now, there's a little bit of nuance in terms of the users within Salto, what access they need. I think probably we will follow up. I shouldn't say probably. We will follow up with some links to our documentation that provide a little bit more of the exact permissions that are required to make the changes using Salto. And then we also had a question come in asking, does this work with JSM and assets as well? And I guess twofold with JSM, yes, actually Salto does work with JSM, so we can manage queues, all of the parts of JSM, and then we are also very soon rolling out support for the object schemas around the assets, not the assets themselves, because of very similar to how the issues can contain data, and Salto doesn't touch the issues as they contain data. Some of the assets can contain data as well, but however, so we can move over the schemas as well. All right. Oh, and one more question I saw, could you use Salto with the standard plan? And yes, you can deploy Salto actually between any two environments. And you can use Salto with whatever Jira license that you have. So now that I've got this deployment, it's sitting there queued, and I need someone to approve it to be able to move forward with this process. Now I'm going to, if you all give me just about 15 seconds, I am going to log into another window and approve this change. Obviously, in a real world example, you should not approve your own change. So this is just for demonstration purposes.
You're giving away the shortcuts to life.
Yeah. Well, you'll see also when this changes that I've created an alter ego for myself. But as soon as I've approved this change, I've also enabled another aspect of Salto that's part of our advanced functionality, and this is running the Salto CLI as part of a GitHub action, or you can run this with whatever Git provider that you have to kick off this deployment to run automatically. So you can imagine if you are a release manager, you come into Salto, you can review all of the deployments that are in pending status. You could go into GitHub, you could review those changes, and then as soon as you approve those changes, actually I didn't click back to the screen fast enough, but you can see the deployment is already completed. So you can completely automate the approval and deployment process here in Salto.
Which is so much better than doing it the way it's designed out of the box, which is do your changes in the sandbox, put your sandbox on one screen, and recreate everything in production, or vice versa.
Now, even better than that, so let's say that this deployment that I just did, where I added this new workflow and I added the status, it's a relatively simple change, but what if it had some really unintended consequences for my users in production? I needed to revert that change. So with Salto, it's as easy as selecting that deployment and clicking revert, and Salto will then create a deployment that essentially reverses everything that you just did in that deployment. Now, you can also select multiple of these past deployments to revert those changes within. Now, although this is a very quick action, it also runs through the validation process again, and making sure that there's no required dependencies, there's been no additional changes to those elements. So it still runs through the entire validation process. Now, if I go back into this deployment here, Salto is going to automatically document these changes in terms of, you can see who made the change, when they made the change, and what was the exact change that was made. as well as because we're connected to that Git repo, and again, that's GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever Git provider that you might use. Salto will push up those changes directly into a branch in that Git repo that represents that environment. So now you have a long living branch in that Git repo that represents all the changes that you're making, which in turn will update your Jira ticket or whatever ticket platform that you might use to track actual changes to Jira, so that you can always tie it back to a specific change. And then if you are using that that architecture where you have multiple prod sites, or you need to deploy between multiple tenants, you can use the promote workflow by clicking on promote and selecting a past deployment, clicking on promote, and then taking that same scope of elements, almost like a deployment package, and then deploying to a new environment. So not only are you going to save time by not having to pull up those screens like Alex mentioned, where you pull up sandbox, pull up prod, and make sure you got everything aligned, but you don't need to do that again by promoting those changes. All right, so let me jump into the version control tab here. So with Salto, you're going to be able to document the entire change management process. So it's not about only documenting the deployments, like I had mentioned, but what happens when you've got a hot fix that's made directly in production, you've got other changes that are made directly in production. How do you track that? Alex, I'm curious, let's say users make a change directly in production. How are you going to catch that beyond just your end user saying like, hey, something broke? Is there another way that you can track that?
There's I'll use the word sloppy log file that Atlassian maintains, but it's so hard to find. And what adds insult to injury is that we've been referring to everything we've been talking about here as an individual, of one persona. But oftentimes you have a team of administrators. And so while you could be cautious and know what you're doing or track or keep your paper trail, another admin might not have the same due diligence, right? And so being able to have better oversight as to who's making the different changes and if something needs to be rolled back or something needs to be audited, like this is just so amazing. Because typically what ends up happening, like a real world scenario, is somebody will go and rename a status in Jira from like in progress to in development. Well, that's a big no-no. You never rename statuses in Jira without having some significant consequences. But figuring out who done it, good luck. You're never gonna find out, right? Somebody has to admit to the fact that they did the change. And so this right here, again, not only does it keep the paper trail, but if it was a bad change, you can always roll it back too.
So on this version control tab here, it's going to keep track of all of the changes that have been pushed up as part of deployments. But additionally, let's say that in the situation you mentioned, Alex, where someone's renamed a status or made a change like that. If they make it directly in production, Salto is going to see that change at the time of the fetch. We're going to cross-reference all of the changes that have been pushed up to Git. And if there's any sort of mismatch, in other words, something that hasn't been pushed up to Git, we're going to flag that as an unpushed file. So if I click preview push here, it is going to show me all of the changes that have been made, but have not been pushed up to Git. In other words, not part of a Salto deployment. And now I can go directly into one. So here I can see that someone actually removed a queue from one of my JSM projects. Now let's say this was part of a hotfix. This was part of a known work. Maybe I was working with a consultant who didn't have access to Salto. I can go ahead and select these changes, and I can add a commit message. Maybe I know that like, hey, this is part of ticket 423. I can push those changes up. And even though it's not part of the Salto deployment process, I'm still able to track those changes and get everything documented.
And this is such a very neat feature because based on that poll, right, 50% are going to have that sandbox. So being able to deploy changes back and forth, awesome. But for the folks that don't have a sandbox, your only option is to just do it in production, which is very dangerous, right? And so this is a great way to at least get a summary view of like, hey, these are some recent changes, and now you can also then add the paper trail and add that extra layer of due diligence for those audits.
I did see a question come in from Aaron. Suppose you deploy a change from Jira site A to Jira site B, and then you select promote to Jira site C as well. But Jira site C is missing a required dependency that wasn't a problem in the first deployment. So how would that scenario play out? Great question. So in that case, when you do the promotion process within Salto, it's going to run that dependency analysis again. So if there are any dependencies of missing in that last or that third site that weren't present in the first and second site, Salto will flag that as a required dependency, even though it wasn't a required dependency in the first deployment. So all that to say is that each deployment done with Salto, whether it's promotion or a revert, we still run that validation and make sure that we're not missing any dependencies along the way. All right, so one, kind of going down that same vein of documenting changes, beyond just documenting changes, you want to be able to monitor for changes. Monitoring for changes that are happening directly in production. So using Salto, you're able to set up individual notifications to be sent out whenever changes are made. And you can basically set them up on anything that Salto is managing. So here I've got an example where I set it up that anytime a workflow is modified, and that's regardless if it's happening in the Jira UI directly or happening through Salto, it's going to send me out an email. You can also set this up for when statuses are renamed or updated, removed, groups are added, and so on. You can also filter it to only if it's made in Jira directly. In other words, if it goes through a Salto deployment, that's fine because that's part of our process. But if it's happening in Jira directly, that's when you want that notification. This can also be sent to Slack as well. Now, when this gets sent out, let me just show you what this looks like. Because the one that I sent earlier, you can see, it's first going to list out in the email what was the exact element that was changed. And then from that, it will attach a PDF with a very detailed view of exactly what was changed, what was added, what was modified. Alex, are there any situations either in the past or that you can think of now where it would be helpful to be notified or that sometimes lack visibility into when admins are making changes in production? Like, for example, you mentioned the renaming of statuses.
Yeah, literally, I would say any change. It would be
Yeah.
great, right? Because the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the less visibility you have. And so it's really, really good from accountability perspective. And just some changes in Jira, right? The administration of Jira is somewhat solid, but there's a couple of different items in there that are finicky that you can think that they're low risk or aren't going to have a big impact, and they can be very detrimental. So I would say being notified of any change, I think, is a good change or a good idea for me.
Which I've got a customer that does that with Salto as well. Because one of the things you can do is simply set up a monitor for any change. And then they put that into a Slack channel. So it's just constantly monitoring every single change that's happening to their production environment. All right. So if you have any questions, again, please put them into the Q&A. Happy to answer any questions that might come along. I have kind of reached the end of kind of what I wanted to show you about the Salto platform. But if you did have any additional questions, please let us know. We'll also be sending out a recording as well as some documentation if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Salto. Also, I wanted to kind of follow up with that question earlier about being able to deploy org to org and whether or not we need to license Salto in each org. We'll make sure to get you all some information about that, but it's less about each org having to license Salto and more about the environment being licensed in Salto. So each has to do a little bit more with our pricing scheme, but essentially in Salto, you don't necessarily need to license an org, but it's just a matter of the licenses that you paid for an environment. And we had a great comment from Aaron saying that one nice benefit is found with Salto is that you can use a second smaller standard site as your sandbox, and then use Salto to synchronize that. So it's not an official sandbox, but you can almost use it as a sandbox because you're able to move changes in between environments.
Excellent point.
I actually use that quite a bit. That exact methodology when I'm testing out some changes with Salto. Oh, I got Alex. I've got a question for you from the Q&A. Then, do you use Salto as a consultant for external clients?
So it's not up to me. The company picks, but it's definitely a recommended item that usually a plugin, right? Like something like Salto comes to question when something has gone wrong. Right? Because most companies they tend to be a little bit frugal until they have a problem. And it's better to invest in something like Salto so that you don't have to then explain yourself as to why something's really, really, really bad. Right. But yeah, typically I don't usually have authorities over that. It's usually the company that they get to pick if they want to do it or not. But I do make professional recommendations based on scars that they may or may not have endured already.
Yeah, I actually work a lot with some customers that also utilize a consultant, and they make heavy use of this monitoring feature because not all of them might have, they're not necessarily sure what the other consultants are doing. So they set up this monitor as a great way to understand what's actually happening in production. So they're not making kind of overriding each other's changes.
Yeah. Should also point out that I don't work for Salto.
Awesome. Any more questions before we'll probably wrap up here soon, unless there's more questions. But again, we will be sending out a recording of the group demo, and we will provide some documentation with a little bit more about Salto, especially based on some of these great questions that we've been getting. And if there are no more questions, we will probably log off just a couple minutes early. Hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Yeah, thank you for joining, Alex. Great stories.